Sorry about that, you guys. At the end of part 3, I had an itchy trigger finger and I hit stop before I finished talking. That's what happens when your brain and your motor functions aren't exactly matched up. So that's what you have to look forward to in your 40s. There you go. So what I was saying, we were almost at the end anyway. What I was saying was the Green Book, which the House Ways and Means Committee puts out every other year, so at the beginning of a new Congress, just describes various social policies, right? We'll click on an obscure one here, railroad benefits, and it basically talks about that particular policy area. It gives an overview of what the railroad benefit program is, and then it gives some information about eligibility and recipients and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's a good resource. It's really meant for legislators and policymakers, but it's also a good resource for you guys too as you're doing research in this particular area. Okay. So that's the first 2 phases, formulation and legislation. Let's move on then to phase 3 of the policy process, which is implementation. So this competes for, if not beats out, agenda setting and formulation as the most important part of the policy process. In fact, for me, I think it is the most important because implementation is really where the rubber meets the road, right? I mean, it's exactly where policy is actually being put into practice. So formally defined, it's the set of activities directed towards putting a program into effect. And implementation really requires 3 activities. It requires organization, for one, right? Because you have to establish the resources, the offices, the actual way that you're going to administer a program, right? So you have to have some organization to it. Interpretation, where you translate the legislative language to actually create the policy rules. We'll talk more about that in just a second. And then application. So that's actually the provision of services. How are people going to access the program? Payments or other agreed upon program objectives would be here. So how do you actually apply the rules that we've created through the organization that we've set up, right? So this is actual government intervention. This is really the nuts and bolts of policy making. Food inspectors actually go out and inspect food. Teachers actually go out and teach. Social workers actually go out and do casework with clients, right? This is the implementation phase where line workers, street-level bureaucrats, we call them, are putting this policy into effect. Really important. So how does this process happen? Typically, the machinery is this. Congress passes a law, as we were just talking about. They pass authorizing legislation. Typically, that authorizing legislation is very vague and ambiguous. And Congress passes vague and ambiguous legislation for a reason. It allows them to shift blame, for one. So if the policy doesn't work out, they can always say, well, that's not exactly what we meant. But on a more practical basis, sometimes they don't know. They don't know how to implement a policy, right? Imagine that Congress passes a law authorizing the creation of a national high-speed rail service in my dreams. And they don't know anything about building high-speed rail. They don't know anything about transportation and logistics. They know just enough to get us into trouble. It's the Bureau of Transportation or the Department of Transportation that's going to handle that, right? They're actually going to make the rules, and that's what the process is called, bureaucratic rulemaking, to implement the policy, okay? So that's another reason that legislation is typically vague. Congress just lacks specific expertise in many areas, right? So Congress then delegates legislative authority or bureaucratic authority to agencies, and this would be true also of state legislatures at the state level in some but not all cases, okay? But at the federal level, that bureaucratic discretion is authorized by the Congress so that agencies can implement those legislative directives. Again, this process is called rulemaking. Rules are published, so proposed policy implementation rules are published in the Federal Register, right? And so, again, one of our slow link, but we can at least click it and go visit the Federal Register. Just like the Congressional Record, the Federal Register is updated on a daily basis. And you can see when it opens up here, it's going to show you all the rules that have been promulgated and proposed and recorded in the Federal Register at a particular time. Now, the Federal Register is really a democratic accountability process, basically, because what it does is it gives me and you, individuals in the public, time and space to comment, a comment period, right, on any proposed rules. So this is what makes bureaucracy democratic, right? And I'm going to talk a little more about that in a minute, but this is an access point. So just like there are access points for legislation, right? We can lobby legislators, or we can work through think tanks or interest groups as policies being formulated, right? So the first two stages of the process. There's also an access point for the public here, right? If you know how to access it and you're able to access it. And again, that's through the Federal Register. So you can see kind of some of the things that have been, some of the rules that have been promulgated. Clearly, the trade representative has filed a public notice on our trade war with China for all intents and purposes, right? And you can see that here. And if you click on that, you could see actually the policy that's being put into effect on this particular issue. Now, typically there's a comment period. It varies. Typically it's not less than 60 days, although it could be. But it's exactly what it sounds like. The public can go in, you and I could go in, we could make a comment, we could file a protest, we could file a brief, we could say, I oppose this rule for this reason. So it very much is kind of an accountability and democratic process here, right? This is our democratic access to bureaucratic rulemaking. It's fun to play around with, too. You can look up all kinds of rules that have been proposed. Maybe that's just for nerdy people like me, but I love the Federal Register because it does give you a glimpse into really what's happening on a day-to-day basis in government and what bureaucratic agencies are doing, right? So as I kind of just suggested, bureaucracy is a counter-majoritarian institution. And what that means is simply that bureaucrats were not elected by majority rule or by majority vote. They were not appointed by somebody who was elected. When I'm talking about bureaucrats here, I'm talking about career civil servants, people who applied for and were awarded jobs in the federal government based on their knowledge, skills, and abilities, or their policy expertise, right? So these folks are supposed to be, and are for the most part, nonpartisan. They are devoted to the policy issue and to the agency rather than a particular party or politician, although certainly they often get caught up in politics, right? So nonpartisan expertise is valued. And this is the point, again, where you can access that counter-majoritarian institution, right? Just like the courts are counter-majoritarian institutions, but you can access the courts either by filing a lawsuit, for one, or by filing an amicus brief. And that's a way to lobby and to democratically access the courts. Same thing here, right? The implementation phase is the phase of policy where we're most likely to encounter the voluntary sector and privatization. So I'm going to kind of veer off for a second and talk about both of those things, right? So the voluntary sector is basically the group of advocacy organizations and interest groups and firms that advocate for and serve populations that cannot adequately represent themselves, right? And this would include non-humans even, right? So think about animal welfare organizations. That would be included in the voluntary sector. Environmental organizations, right? The earth can't represent itself in government. So an advocacy organization does that, right? And the voluntary sector spans a pretty wide range of organizations. So we think about public and private hospitals. I put public here because you're most likely in this particular area to deal with nonprofit public hospitals. But also schools and education organizations like Teach for America, for example, would fit into this area. Religious institutions like the Catholic Charities is probably the most prominent one in social policy. Welfare agencies, so voluntary groups that help with actually administering welfare programs. Fraternal organizations, right? So, for example, the Lions Club has a big focus on eyesight. So they help provide eyeglasses to underprivileged children and adults who otherwise couldn't afford them. Rotary Club. Rotary, their big thing is that they help to eliminate polio by helping to get polio vaccines in poor and underdeveloped countries. And now they're working on clean water as an issue, both in the United States and in underdeveloped countries. What other ones? Rotary, Lions. Oh, Shriners, obviously, they provide children's hospitals and fund children's hospitals, right? So those kind of fraternal associations, that's what I'm talking about. Arts and humanities organizations. So these are, would be symphonies, orchestras, museums, public preservation, historic preservation organizations, and so on and so forth. And again, environmental organizations would fit here. I also have a link here, and this link will take you to GuideStar. And GuideStar is kind of the gold standard for registering charities and voluntary organizations. And so I kind of like the way they break out types of voluntary organizations and charitable organizations. So on their website, you will see, load on up there, buddy. Come on. You can do it. Come on. But on their website, you will see categories of charitable and nonprofit organizations, and you can browse them. And the great thing about GuideStar, too, is that they rate them. So if you're thinking of donating to a particular organization, you know exactly what they do with their money. GuideStar tells you, and they tell you kind of a little bit about their political involvement, too. So if you're interested in nonprofits, that's a great website for you. I'm not going to click on these two links here just because I don't want to have to wait on those to load. But when we talk about organizations, private foundations. I don't want to forget that. So the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, right? These are philanthropic foundations that do research and make charitable grants across a wide variety of programs. You'll often hear them, if you've ever watched PBS, at the end of a PBS program like Masterpiece, it'll say, this viewing of Masterpiece supported by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, right? But they do a lot beyond just PBS. And those private foundations aren't necessarily focused on just one policy area. Social entrepreneurship and social innovation are also two kind of emerging areas that we often look at in policy implementation, especially when we think about how the voluntary sector interacts with government or social policy in implementing policy across the board. I'm just going to mention two examples here so that you kind of have an idea of what we mean by social entrepreneurship, right? I mean, when we think about social entrepreneurship, we're thinking about people who are investing in social innovation in the same way somebody might invest in a business, right? Social entrepreneurs are really concerned about the shrinking of civil society. And we've talked about that, right? Remember, civil society is kind of the voluntary space outside of the state or market where we come together voluntarily and we work out life's problems and we build trust in community, and it's good for democracy, right? So when we talk about social entrepreneurs are concerned about that, and they want to bring back civil society, right? And so I'm trying to stick to my 15-minute time limit, so I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up in part 4 here, or part 5 rather, because I really want to mention these two examples, and I don't want to short you out on time either. So hold that thought, and we'll come back in part 5.